watched this.
Yeah.
I just can't anymore. Yeah, I'll probably do the first step.
I watched the highlights.
Okay, I was just
I don't want to.
I don't want to waste any more time on this.
My friends like edited her website, like not really, but like just you know how you
Oh, do you really?
No, I still went there, but like while I was waiting, I
5 minutes earlier. You didn't have to.
yeah, then I wouldn't have saw
Not every day. Yeah, you're no longer a student, right? Yeah. Oh, you
yeah, for me, I was
They're saying that I didn't
Well, yeah.
I don't know.
It's actually really close. So I went to
We have a green and Alan, you have a light green.
No. Oh, where's that?
I mean, more about it. Just you what? Let's go. The stale Carnegie Pablo Escobar roots, I think that's beneath you.
Things aren't going to be like Escobar HMA. Things have changed over here.
You have engaged the Klingons. I'm trying to save all of you.
We're back together again! So loud. I really, really hope I get to see boobs.
We approve! That chicken back! Another summer come and gone.
What are you doing? Oh my God! Hi!
Hi.
Help me find my mom, and I'll leave you alone forever.
Deal. Somebody tell me why we're here.
Because we're alive. Scream as loud as you possibly can.
How do you measure the distance of reasonable fear?
They're all doping. Every single one of them.
Seatbelts, everyone! Let's do this.
Form Voltron!
Well, I love this person. I want to spend the rest of my life with her. And I don't want to risk losing her and go back to wearing a condom.
I don't think I'm afraid to die. I prefer it happens quickly. Like the transition, I just want it to be like boom, boom. You know, I'd like my last words to be something like, wait, what?
All right, welcome Tableau user group to Netflix. I'm Albert Wong. I'll be your host for tonight. So 4 years ago, I attended my first Tableau meetup, and it was in a little room in Palo Alto of like 60 people or so. And during that meetup, I actually presented with my colleague our little Tableau setup at Netflix. So some of you might have been there and might have remembered. But at the time, we were really small scale. We had like 10 users. 2 of them were in the room. And it was kind of like an experiment. We weren't sure where we were going to go with Tableau. Fast forward 4 years to today, and we have like 2,000 users. And it's this like flourishing ecosystem at Netflix. And so, I think about that first day in Palo Alto, and all the relationships that I've met at Tableau meetups that have helped us along in our Tableau journey. And I'm just super grateful that I have this opportunity to be able to give back and help others along their journey. So I just want to say thanks for coming. And we have a lot programmed for tonight. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Anya, our Tableau community leader, to come up to the stage and kick us off.
Thank you for Netflix for throwing out this awesome event. We've got some great speakers. This is how awesome this presentation is. My 12-year-old son's PowerPoint he just did. That's cool. We just passed out these little flags. My one obligation as community leader, I just have to get a picture of you guys holding them up. Sorry. Did you turn off the light back there? Sorry.
You need flags, you got flags.
All right, everyone. 1, 2, 3. We are. That light is. 1, 2, 3. We are dab people. Woo! All right, want to get everyone dabbing? Can you all dab? 1, 2, 3. Dab! All right. So I'm the interim chair of the San Francisco Tableau user group. We are always looking for people to present as well as venues to host. We're looking for everything from data storytelling to server administration to just, it could be something in D3 that we could all learn from. So if you're ever interested in presenting or hosting, please email anya@datablick.com and we'll be able to throw more awesome events like this. Thank you. Yay.
Okay, hey everybody. How's it going? Give me a second to get set up here. When I was rehearsing, I took up so much space. I was like all over the place. I was like changing behavior and getting into it. And then I got here and they told me that I needed to stay between these two lines. So I'm going to try to do that. And I'm just going to try to focus all that energy right here so it can stay super concentrated. And if I fail, then I hope that the AV guy can keep up. I heard today, I had lunch with some cool people at Lyft today with the data visualization director at Lyft, and he said, AI is easy, AV is hard. Okay, so, hi, good evening. My name is Keith Helfrich. Some of you were in the room a couple of years ago when I did my first presentation at Charles Schwab. I'm back now to kind of round that out with some new content that I've created that I think is really compelling. And it's about changing behavior with data. To me, when I found Tableau, I've got that same story, like the things went up my spine, and I was like, this is it, and I'm all over it, and I haven't stopped since. And there was something very particular about my fanaticism, which is that linking together of the seeing and the sensing and the feeling of what's going on in the world through the data, and then changing the way we behave, the learning process and evolution process, and the ability to do that at scale with really big organizations and even at scale with really important individuals, single individuals. And so to me, changing behavior with data is the name of the game. It's why we do what we do. And yet, that can be elusive. So I work as an independent consultant with some of the finest individuals around the largest Tableau server in the world. Some of those folks are in the room today. I've got a small group of consultants working at Apple. And that environment at Apple has given me the opportunity to pursue this passion that I have unobstructed. They've given me the opportunity to pursue that passion with my own sense of purpose and with my own sense of autonomy and with my own sense of mastery. And it's in that space that I've been able to thrive and produce this little company. And I named the little company Action Analytics because for me, that's what it's all about. It's about taking the analytics that we do, the visual analytics that we do, and producing action. And so how does that work? How do we get from reaching insight from data and then actually modifying our own or somebody else's behavior? Well, it all begins with effective communication, effectively transmitting this insight that I've gained into another person's brain. And we could talk on and on about what is effective communication, but at the end of the day, effective communication is really just getting messages across. It's taking this message that I've generated and getting it across successfully into your brain. And therefore, it follows we should understand if changing behavior is getting messages across, we should begin with what is this thing that I'm transmitting? What are these messages? Well, a message is not the raw information. The raw information by itself is not a message. A message is the raw information plus the intelligent value that you as the author have added on to that raw information. So the getting across of the messages is transmitting not just the data, but the data and the intelligent value that you as the visualization author have added. And so if that is the definition of what is a message, I would ask, most of you in the room are data practitioners. You go to work every day. Do you see yourselves as people who add intelligent value to data? Is that a term that applies to you? I think most of you would say, yes, that's what I do. I add intelligent value to data. But did you think of yourself as a person who generates messages? And from there, now that we know that it's about effectively communicating our message, a very easy misnomer to slip into is to think that it's simple. There's a straight line between a convincing data message and then I transmit effectively that message into my audience's mind, and that from there they will go off and take action. And that's not true. In fact, it's very frequently not true. It turns out instead that on very effectively communicating a very clear and crisp data-driven message, the behavior doesn't change. And it's into that, what's going on there, that I want to dig tonight. It's into that, what's happening there, that I want to unpack. And unpacking that has been this fabulous journey for me, because when I signed up to give this talk, I didn't have this content. I used it as a forcing function so that I could learn on my own journey how to compel others to action with my data visualizations, and you're going to be really surprised by what I found. So in this journey to figure out how I could change other people's behavior with data visualization, I started at this, my favorite model, the cycle of visual analytics. I teach Tableau, and I teach from this model all the time. And you've probably seen it. It's not exactly around, we bounce back and forth, it's an iterative process, but it starts with some kind of task, and then to solve that task I get some data, and I work with that data, and I encode it visually, and in doing, I can see it, and I can understand it, and I garner some insight, and from that insight, I go off and I take some action, or I compel and I convince others to take action, and that's how the cycle goes. And I love it, and I love Tableau because they've built this fabulous tool that allows me as the data visualization practitioner to stay in the flow while I'm doing that, and to keep my groove while that's going on. And so I started here, and I said, okay, it's into this act step that I just want to deep dive, because all of those other things can happen. As an enterprise, as an organization, we can invest millions of dollars to make all of the other things possible. And then if the behavior doesn't change as a result of what we've done, it's all been for naught. Like, nothing has come from what we invested into finding the insight. And I personally am very concerned with the state of humanity. And some of what I'm going to speak tonight is actually speaking to at a level that is above and beyond your organization and your role in your organization, but it's actually your role on this planet, right? If we as humans don't learn to feel what's going on in the world around us and change our behavior based on what we see, we're going to fail. So in this effort that I set out on to deep dive into this step, to make sure that that step, if anything, happens effectively, I said, okay, actually RJ recommended. RJ said, why don't you look to some other models? And I said, okay, so we opened some books, and I started with Alberto Cairo, and I went to Alberto Cairo and I said, Alberto, the functional art, you've got a model. And Alberto's model goes from the outside world into other people's brains through us as vehicles, through us as communicators. And we as communicators take unstructured information and we encode that information, and then we transmit it to our audience. And our audience then decodes that information using their experience and their memories. So right off, I mean, like, first step, I'm digging into this and I land like smack is in my face, story and narrative, right? Our audience is going to decode those intelligent value-added messages that we give them using their own experiences and memories. And so Alberto says, this is how it works. Data goes from the outside world through us as communicators to our audience. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool, but Alberto, like, there's something for me that's missing. I named my company Action Analytics, and your model ends at knowledge and wisdom. And like, I'm in enterprise, I'm in business, I'm a man of action, I got to get things done. And you as an academic are satisfied. The knowledge and the wisdom are your end to which everything is invested. But for me, like, I got to take your model and I got to bookend that thing. I need a clear connection to a North Star because I'm an achiever and I need to know what on this earth I want to achieve. And then as a result of what I do, I need to make certain that it gets done. And so I said, okay, let me see then, is there some other giant who I can lean on? And I went from Alberto, I went to Andy Kirk, and I went to Andy Kirk's model. Very smart man, and he's got a 4-step process. He says, you know, we plan and we iterate our project, we get some data, we go through some data prep, we plan what we're gonna do, and we design our solution, and then we build it. And I'm like, man, Andy, you've got the same thing going on that Alberto does. I'm like, dude, like, to me, it's all about connecting with this and seeing it all the way through to this. I'm coming. So I said, all right, I'm in this. I'm a thought leader. I'm speaking to 150 people. I'll make my own 4-step process. It can't be that hard. There's only 4 steps. You connect with your goal. You get some data. You work with that data. You add intelligent value to that data. And you use those messages that you've created by adding intelligent value to data to compel others to action. And in so doing, we change the world. All right, so that's my 4-step model, and I'm like, I'm happy with that. Already, like, I got a model. And so then RJ and I were talking, and I was like, but now that I've got this model, it's got to be effective, or it's still like I'm just spinning my wheels, right? So I continued my search, and I wound up in this search for what makes an effective data visualization. And I actually like this model a lot. I teach from it quite a bit because it's from David McCandless. And he says that a successful data visualization is the intersection between these 4 ingredients. You need a strong sense of purpose. You need a goal. You need strong, solid data. And you also need visual encoding, and you need story, and you need narrative. And unless you have all 4 of those things, something is missing, and your data visualization is not successful, he says. And I'm like, okay, but I've already decided that what, for me, a successful visualization is it's a data visualization that compels my audience to action. And so for that reason, and also RJ says, he said, let's flip this thing on its head, because I don't like the way that the center is at the bottom. So we flipped it on its head. And I said, I like that. I like these 4 ingredients, but I'm going to put in the middle compelling data message. Because changing behavior with information is the name of the game. And that's done through data-driven messages that compel our audience to action. And I'm like, all right, now let's build this thing out. And in order to build it out, it may be kind of easy and informative to see what it's like when some of these pieces are missing. So what would happen, for example, if we had only the data and only the goal, but we didn't have the visualization and we didn't have the story? Well, in that case, I've got a massive amount of information and something I want to achieve with it. And that's nothing but a giant impervious wall of data. That's a spreadsheet. And a spreadsheet in and of itself is not a compelling data message. Okay. From there, it makes sense then that enterprises such as yours and mine are spinning up these visualization programs, because we've got ever-increasing wells and volumes of information, volumes of data to work with, and we've always had goals and objectives. So we spin up these visualization programs in order to help ourselves see and understand that information. And so when we add the visualization, we get the ability to see and understand. But in this compelling our audience to action model, something is still missing, and those visualizations are ineffective. I may produce a very convincing data visualization. I may show clearly exactly what needs to occur, and yet still fail to compel my audience to action. And on the other hand, if I have just the data, just the goal, and a story, but I haven't visualized it, that's very confusing. I'm just a fanatical guy who's got something to say about a giant wall of data, and my audience can't see it, they can't understand it. Without the visual encoding, it's very confusing. So it's the intersection of all 4 of these things that makes a compelling data message. Now here, 10 minutes into my talk, I've reached then the conclusion that a prettier wall of numbers doesn't change the way that decisions get made. And that was the most disappointing conclusion that I have ever landed on an audience at 10 minutes into the talk to date, because you knew that when you walked in the door. You knew that. You knew already that somebody at a Tableau user group was going to get up on stage and say a prettier wall of numbers doesn't change the way decisions get made. And so what then do I have to offer that's new? What I have to offer to this equation that is new to you is that it's your role in this world to change the way decisions get made. It's your job to change the way decisions get made. And so if you, to date, have seen yourself as somebody who works with data, but it's somebody else's job to change the organization's behavior, you have been abdicating your responsibility and not fulfilling your role as a data worker who adds intelligent value to data, because you're the one who spends all the time with the data. You're the one who has the insights. and you're the one who generates the messages. And so in our 4-step process, if you don't connect your work to the goal and make certain that the results of your work cause a change in behavior, then you're just participating in the nothing getting done. So let's dig into that a little bit. Let's unpack that. Because I've just made what I think is a very existential threat to your identity. How do you see yourself when you go to work in the day? How do you describe your role in your organization? What words do you use? What's your story? With what role in the organization do you identify? Do you see yourself as an analyst? Do you see yourself as somebody who solves really complex problems and in so doing is something of a hero because of how complex the problems are you solve? Or do you see yourself as somebody who's more of an author who generates messages? Which one is it? Something else. Earlier today, somebody said, I'm a priest. Whatever it is, like, how do you describe yourself? And for the sake of this talk, are you an analyst or are you an author? If you're an analyst who says it's somebody else's job to generate the messages, I say it's time for you to show some courage and begin to act with heart and step into your new hero's journey on the road to becoming an author. If you see yourself as somebody in your organization who works with data but doesn't have a voice, it's time to change that story you're telling yourself. And if you're an author, it's time for you too to show some courage. Step into that hero's journey and continue your evolution to the path of becoming an agent of change. To the path of making certain that those messages that are data-driven that you are authoring are connected to the goal and the change in behavior of the organization. So that's what I'm saying. I'm saying it's your job to do something about this. It's not somebody else's job. It's your job to make certain that those 4 steps are connected through end to end. And how do I get there? Because as an existential threat to your sense of self, you're like, okay, convince me, dude, because when I walked in the room, my story was that I don't have a voice, or my story was that that's not me. Let me see if I can convince you. It goes like this. Here's a very convincing argument. We, as a part of this organization, have a goal. And that goal lies elsewhere. It lies someplace other than where we are today. We've been making a bunch of decisions. The decisions we made got us here to where we are today. And what we've done up until now is not sufficient to get us to where we want to be. Therefore, it follows logically that the organization's, our behavior must change. What we've done up to now won't get us to where we want to be. Therefore, we got to do something different. That's valid. That's sound. That is a very convincing argument that the organization's behavior must change. Okay. So the organization's behavior must change, but how did I arrive at the fact that it's your responsibility to do something about it? Well, given that the organization's behavior must change and that you, as an individual working in this organization, you have your own goals. Your goals are in alignment with the organization's goals. If they weren't, you wouldn't be there. And what you do in all of this is add value to data, so therefore it follows that what you do is add intelligent value to data in order to change behavior such that we can meet our goals. Now, I hope that was convincing. I expect that that was convincing. And I also hope and expect that some of you, just on that convincing argument, will go to work tomorrow with a different sense of self. And then I also hope and expect that some of you will go to work tomorrow and not change a goddamn thing about the way you behave. I know that there's some of you that, based on that convincing argument, are not going to change your sense of self. And the reason is because you've got some story in your head, some narrative that's going on that includes the words can't, won't, or don't. And as convincing as my argument may be, it didn't change that narrative. And by not doing so, your behavior is not going to change. And so what I'm saying is, if you see yourself as just working with data, it's time to see yourself is making certain that the entire chain is visioned all the way through, connecting with the higher sense of purpose, working on data that inspires you intrinsically, adding your intelligent value to that data, and then seeing that the world changes as a result of what you do. And for those of you who have got that can't, won't, don't story going on, by the time we're done, I hope to modify that narrative. And in so doing, compel you into action. So, as I mentioned, if you're currently an analyst and you're going to become an author, you need to show some heart. You have to act with courage. If the story in your head is that you're one of these people and everybody's perfect and you got to be perfect, you got to get rid of that right away because nobody's perfect. And perfection is not courageous. The hero's journey that you're stepping into requires courage because you're going to act with imperfection. Courage is not the acting in the absence of fear. It's acting in the mastery of it. If you're an author and you're going to step up and you're going to make certain that the data-driven messages that you send out into your organization are changing behavior, that's going to take courage to transform not only the way you see yourself, but the way the organization sees you. That takes courage. So we've danced around it, and now here we are. It's time for the deep dive into story and narrative. That's why we're here. You know, like the reason I said I want to write this talk is because I hear about this conference and that conference, and everybody's talking about telling stories with data. And I'm like, why is everybody talking about telling stories with data? Like why on earth is everybody talking about telling stories with data? It's like what is it all about? And so I set out on my own mission to figure out why on earth is it, how do I, here's how it goes. I'm like, on the one hand, why is everybody talking about telling stories with data? On the other hand, I'm like, what I'm all about is changing behavior. So I set out in my direction to figure out how to change other people's behavior, and I wound up at telling stories with data. That's how it goes. So, you know, I looked at Alberto's model, and I looked at Andy Kirk's model, and I said both of them, like, you've got great models for producing data visualizations, but we got to bookend these things. I need a goal, I need a clear connection with a higher sense of purpose, and I need an effective call to action on the other side. So what is it, the one thing in our experience as human beings on this planet, what is the one thing that connects goals with action? One thing. It's story. And like that landed on you like a ton of bricks because you had no idea. I had no idea until I started looking into it. Well, let me walk you through it. We all know that we're intentional agents as human beings. We go out every day, every moment, and we act with intention. We want to brush our teeth. We want to earn more money. We want to find love. Whatever it is, we've got intention and purpose, and we shape our actions in the world based on those desires and those beliefs. We're intentional beings. It's story in our experience as human beings that organizes and conveys those motivated action sequences as plots through time. And it's story, which is the way not only that we organize and convey those action sequences, but it's the way that we understand ourselves. And it's the way that we understand others. It's through narrative that we take our experience in the world and we translate it into meaning. In virtually every story ever, a human or a human-like character has set out to accomplish some type of goal based on his or her beliefs and desires, taken action, produced a series of reactions, and it's the story that extends that plot through time. That's what story is. In other words, human intentionality is at the very heart of narrative. Our aim to accomplish something and our connecting that aim to accomplish something with action is narrative. And those narratives tend to repeat in these archetypal, epic stories that ravage through our cultures and ravage through our minds. And it's story and narrative that we use to perceive the world. So much so that literally every direct experience that you have as a human being, like stubbing your toe, the moment that experience becomes a thought in your brain, it has already been woven into your ongoing and never-ending and ever-evolving internal narrative that is your life story. Story is the way that you understand every experience that ever occurs to you. And so if it's story and narrative that connect goal and action, they do so by weaving together our intentions and our beliefs and our actions and the reactions and our intentions and our beliefs and the actions and the reactions and on and on and on through every moment of the day, even tying your shoe. And being so ingrained narrative as it is in our human experience, it actually comprises who we are and how we see ourselves. So much so that if I have a very strong belief, if I have a conviction, if I believe something very strongly about a certain piece of policy or about a certain thing with the climate or about the way things should be done at work or what my boyfriend or my girlfriend should do or could do, if I believe very strongly in something, that belief is nothing more than my personal equity investment, my investment into that particular narrative. And my investment in that particular narrative being a belief is just one of the particular narratives that I invest in because I have a portfolio of beliefs. And it's that wide-ranging portfolio of beliefs that together culminate up into my ongoing and ever-evolving internal life identity story. My identity, my sense of self, my ego is nothing more than my capacity to keep a particular narrative going. And some people can be very attached to those narratives, but then the real world comes along and it forces them to change. And so the moment that your capacity to keep that particular narrative going reaches its end, your brain finds a way to navigate the story and to find another story, and so your identity evolves. And so this is serious stuff, folks. I mean, because I set out to change people's behavior with data, and I wound up speaking directly to the identity of the organization that I'm working with. I set out to change people's behavior with data, and I wound up having a conversation directly with your sense of self in order to do that. And so back then to how it is that we take this understanding of story and narrative and identity and belief and weave it into our data visualization so that we can solve this problem. How is it then, with this newfound understanding of the importance of story and narrative, do I get over those blockers and communicate effectively with what I'm seeing in the data in order to compel my audience to action? Well, as it turns out, there are three types of learning associated with behavior change, and the first two, they just don't work very well. The first one is the carrot and the stick, the reward and the punishment, and that one doesn't work because the moment the carrot goes away or the stick becomes less sharp, the person's behavior goes right back to the way it was, which is in alignment with their value system. The carrot and the stick, they never modified their values. The second type of learning is this lift and shift kind of thing, where I just take a body of knowledge and I suck it up out of one brain and I stick it into another brain exactly as it is, and I don't give the receiving brain the opportunity to question or have dialogue or understand or integrate with a greater sense of meaning the why. And that lift and shift, it also fails because the moment the context changes and the moment things are a little bit different, because that person's underlying personal value system wasn't modified as a result of the receiving the new knowledge, they go back to behaving just the way they did before. So there's only one type of learning that actually really effectively modifies behavior, and that is identity learning. That is learning through dialogue. And so it really is true that this sense of identity is so important when it comes to changing behavior. And it really is true that story and narrative are so important when it comes to the identity. What I'm saying is that if I want to change behavior with data, then I need to understand these things so that I can marry them together and I can build into my data visualizations narratives that integrate with my audience's sense of self. And so the way that this identity learning works is that if I challenge you, like I did earlier, with some type of new idea that is not currently in your understanding of the way that you see yourself or the way that you see the world, It's new to your ongoing storyline up to now. That experience that you have is challenging, and the first thing that you do is you come up with some kind of primal story, some kind of like fight, flight, freeze kind of thing because you're under threat, right? And it's through this identity learning that we get that individual into a second story. We get that individual to take that first story and let it go, and get them to move into a second story that involves a shift in perspective, an integration of meaning and an understanding of awareness. And that process through which we go from the first story to the second story happens through dialogue. And tell me if this doesn't like make up your day. Conversation, narration, narrative with the outside world, conversation, narration, narrative inside your own head. It's the narrative that you're receiving with the outside world that gets woven into the narrative that's ongoing in your head. And it's the narrative from the outside world and the narrative with self, and the dialogue with the outside world and the dialogue with self. And it's through that dialogue that we as human beings decide how it is that we're going to behave in the world. And the way that we decide how we're going to behave in the world is based on our desires and our beliefs. And those desires and those beliefs then are modified through this dialogical identity learning process. And so then back to my model, how can I build a compelling data visualization that speaks to this dialogical learning process? I want to understand it a little bit deeper. On the left, I've got the data and the story. And really strong data and really strong story together determine the interestingness of my message, the degree to which my data message is interesting. Players in this field include the New York Times. They've got really strong data, they've got really strong stories. Sometimes they've got a goal, maybe not. Sometimes they use visuals, maybe not. But they've got strong data and they've got strong story. And their messages are relevant, they're meaningful, they're new, they're interesting. The intersection of data and story is interestingness. On the right, the intersection of visual and goal is usefulness, utility. The more my data visualization is tightly coupled with the goal that I'm trying to accomplish, the more useful it is. These are my Sankey diagrams, my jump plots, my data visualizations that speak exactly to the thing that they're trying to solve, and they do it perfectly. They're very useful. And in the middle, the interaction between narrative and visual encoding determines how epic my message is, how evocative it is. The intersection between the story and the visual is how illustrative that message is. And as you know, when you come out of a movie, you come out of the movie theater and you've just seen an epic film, you're like all riled up and you want to do something, right? You're motivated to action. You're moved. You've been moved by that epic visual narrative story. And so it's all of these things that come together to produce a compelling data message. And in every different moment, we're never going to be hitting a 10 on all of them. But at some particular moment, if one of them is weak enough, it's going to be weak enough such that the audience, the recipient of your data message, will not be compelled to change their behavior. And so, you know, it isn't always the case that every idea that hits a human being is a confrontation, is a threat. It's not that every new idea hits your audience with a fight, or freeze. It could be the case that this new incoming idea just like, boom, hits right in alignment with their existing narrative. And if that's the case, you run with it, you go with it, right? But on the other hand, if your data message contains some content that is received as a fight, flight, or freeze narrative from your audience because it's not in alignment with their existing sense of self, that portion of you for whom, when I said it's your job to change behavior in your organization, you went like, no, not me. Like, I'm not it. Right? If an idea does hit your audience in that way, then what you're asking for from them as they go from that first story to the second story, you're requesting from them sacrifice. some part of them must die to accept the replacement narrative that you're trying to offer. Some part of who they are has got to be let go in order to transition and make a shift in perspective and reach a new sense of awareness. And so if that's the case, and if specifically what I'm speaking to is changing behavior with data, the idea is that if the behavior wanted to change, it would be changing on its own. So I'm speaking here to those challenging things when it really takes effort and I really need to compose a compelling data message in order to change the behavior. In that case, I would rather it not be like a bloody, messy sacrifice, right? Like, I mean, if I can make it easier on myself and others, I want to do that. So I said, okay, I'm almost there. What I need now is a playbook. I need like a set of checkboxes that if I can narrate these things with my stories, my audience is going to change their behavior by themselves. And then I don't have to work very hard and nobody has to get all messy, right? And so I looked to Daniel Pink. If you've been to the Tableau conference when he's been a keynote speaker, he speaks to what motivates us as humans. And what motivates us as humans is not the extrinsic motivators. It's not the motivators that come from the outside. It's the motivators that well from us from the inside. And once again, here we are at the fact that the carrots and the sticks, they don't work. The things like money, the things like do or else or punishment or title, all of those external things just fade in comparison to the intrinsic motivators. The intrinsic motivators are the things that have your audience just jump to action because they want to, because it comes from the inside. Purpose, autonomy, and mastery. That very same environment that I've been allowed to work with at Apple. And so I say, okay, if those are the narratives that I need to tell my audience to get them to motivate into the new set of behavior that derives from the data, from what the data is showing us so that we can use the data to change our behavior, then what I need to do is just build those things into my data visualizations. I need to make a really compelling data visualization that has strong data, a connection with a strong goal that is very useful so that the visual encoding is tightly coupled to what I'm trying to achieve. And then the story part, I need to just tell the story part to those intrinsic motivators. And when I do that, man, that's a compelling data message. And so to do that, here's my checkbox. To speak to autonomy, I need to build data visualizations that allow for my audience to customize their own adventure. I need to build data visualizations that speak to their sense of autonomy, that allow them to achieve a greater degree of independence. And in so doing, they're going to come back to that data visualization because it helps them to achieve a greater degree of autonomy and independence. And in their life narrative, that is an intrinsic motivator. I need to allow them to choose their own role, to explore new worlds. You get the idea. I need to weave the narratives that I'm telling with my data around the ability to increase my audience's sense of autonomy. And if I want to speak to mastery and learning, then I need to build the narratives that my data is saying in such a way that it speaks to their sense of journey. I need to build for them reputation systems and skill systems and mission trees so that they can see this mission laid out before them and receive real-time feedback as they make progress on that learning mission towards meeting their goal. And if I want to build data visualization messages that have narrative around their sense of purpose and their sense of belonging, then I need to create the narrative of those data message with a backdrop of context and a connection to a sense of purpose. And I need to build the way for them to see that the actions that they're taking based on this data have a connection with purpose and meaning that they can identify with. I need to let them connect with friends over this data. I need to let them join groups and create factions and coalitions and find that sense of connection and purpose and meaning from the story that the data is telling. And in so doing, that piece of the Venn diagram that is story and narrative, that without which my data message is ineffective, will be most effective because the narrative speaks to the things that intrinsically motivate those individuals. And so here I end, and I'm back then with this sense of question about who you are and how you see yourself, and hoping to just, as Alan put it, give you just like an intellectual punch in the teeth and say, hey, let's, all of us, we've got a lot going on in the world, and there's a lot of information in the world. And we are some of the most highly talented people in the world. And if we are applying our talents on a daily basis without a clear sense of a connection to a higher sense of purpose, and without a clear sense of connection to making certain that actions and behaviors of the humans around us are changing as a result of what we do, then we are abdicating our responsibility as sentient beings on this planet. And once you identify with that message, that old story that you had that included can't, won't, and don't, doesn't add up. You can, you will, and it takes courage. I encourage you to do. Thank you.
On Netflix. Let's talk about data storytelling. Are you ready to go on an adventure? And here you. Ready for an adventure? So this is because I am just a computer file without access to the microphone. I am sorry. Please do not delete.
Of course we're going to delete that, because who wants to live their entire life consuming information like that? My name's RJ Andrews. I'm an independent data storyteller, and I want to share with you tonight my enthusiasm for humanizing information. So this is what we do. We take information and we push it into the world. But we have to remember that all of the information that we're pushing first originated in the world, and that we have to keep that in mind as we're crafting our messages. Tonight I'm going to show you a lot of examples of ways that the world have impacted how I create my own data messages. Here's a clip. That's all you get. The reason that's all you get tonight is because you can go watch this. I published it last year. And I want to use our time here tonight to show you some things that nobody has ever seen before. Things that are in process, take you behind the scenes, and then show you stuff that are about to be published in the coming months. But before we move on, I don't have any big, frameworks. I pretty much agree with everything that Keith said. So I'm just going to give you like these just little pinpoints of light associated with all these different projects. And the first kind of pinpoint I want to show is that when I'm making graphics like this, and even when I'm animating graphics like this, I really care about you just sort of falling in love with the national parks and maybe even seeing the national parks in a new way. And I do this with rotating 3D models that look like they're hand-drawn. Is it hand-drawn? I don't know. Is this one hand-drawn? Maybe. I really don't care what you think about the tools and the process and how I got to the end product. What I care about is whether or not it moves you, whether it moves you emotionally, whether it moves you intellectually. But behind the scenes, quite a lot of data that went into that project to make it work. So tonight we're going to show a bunch of stories. We're going to talk about lions and mapping and beers and more. So first, let's go to the Masai Mara. Let's go on safari. In 2015, I had the privilege of living in Kenya with my wife, Kelly. And we took a lot of photos like this. And it's just an incredibly beautiful experience to be close enough to this kind of animal to see it bounding across the savannah. But really quick, I started to feel uncomfortable. I didn't know this animal's name. I didn't know if it was endangered. I didn't really know what it ate, what kind of friends it had. I didn't know if maybe we could eat it. 'Cause you learn when you move to Africa, you can eat a lot of animals. I didn't know if it maybe it was dangerous to us. I had a lot of questions, a lot of curiosity, but mostly I was overwhelmed. What I learned was that when you go to Africa and all you have knowledge about is what the Lion King taught you, Africa is going to whisper back to like, buckle up, buddy. Because there's a lot more going on. And while I was over there, I started encountering little bits of information. Things like this. Things like this. Old beat-up field guide. And these pieces of information started to satiate my curiosity. But one of the aspects of, one of the personality traits and aspects of people who work with data, I think, is to develop sort of holistic, all-encompassing models of how the world works. We really have this like organizing personality trait, and I'm very, very guilty. And so I took that curiosity spike, I took some of the information I was encountering in Kenya, and I made this. And so this is a little interactive. There's no music score for this. But what you see is all of the biggest mammals that live in Africa. And they're colored by their endangered species status. They're sized relative to each other. So big animals are big, small animals are small. And they're facing, so their orientation is facing whether their population is increasing or decreasing. And if you select any of them, you can see where they live. So that's the viz. But that's not the emotion. The emotion I was trying to communicate with this viz was the same emotion I had when I first saw these animals. And that was a feeling of being overwhelmed. And I hope that seeing 200 animals at once in an irregular layout sort of assaults you. But it doesn't assault you so much that it turns you off. What I'm really hoping is that there's a couple silhouettes here that are bold enough and familiar enough and big enough that you can say, there's a rhino, there's an elephant, there's a giraffe. I know those animals. I can hook into this somehow. And then immediately afterwards, subconsciously, but there's so much more I don't know. The world is actually much more complex than I ever imagined. So because this is a Tableau meetup, I want to kind of give you a peek behind the scenes, but not because that's what matters, but only because this is the only Tableau viz I'm going to show tonight. But the tools are not what's important. It's the message that's important. It's what you do with the tools that's important. And I'm reminded by Platon in Netflix's Abstract Design series, this great quote. And so in this series, they look at the best people in all these different design fields. For the photographer, they went to Platon, and in the course of the interview, they start asking him like gear questions, like what kind of lens are you using? And he just like, whoa, 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 whoa. That's not what this is about. Like, don't let your tools dominate the message. So, with Platon in mind, here's the tools. This is the goal, to take IUCN data. IUCN sets endangered species status. They push all kind of funding all over the world to go out and study animals, and they set the endangered species status. So when you hear, panda is no longer endangered, you're hearing it from these guys. And so my goal was to start with the IUCN data and then end at Tableau. This is what my process looked like. This is what all my processes look like, actually. But if we had to maybe abstract it out a little bit, the IUCN uses this traffic color light pattern, and I really wanted to preserve that. And so I translated it a little bit so it could be a little bit more accessible. And then the IUCN also provides animal range maps. And we'll revisit those in a moment. So we're getting species status, where they live, and this nice color palette from the IUCN. Now, the first rule of the internet is that people like animals. If they're baby animals, that's even better. And so I knew I wanted a visual hook like connected right to the animals. And I found this French library of old like 1960s field guide illustrations. So I set up all these batch processing so that I could relatively quickly transform, I think I'm using maybe 400 individual images across the viz. Okay, so we have our images. Now layout. All right, layout's important. And there is some method to this madness. All the animals are actually placed next to all of their relatives. So you have all the predators on top, all the food on the bottom, and the closest relatives are actually buddies. And so you can see this right here. See, the zebra, 3 kinds of zebra. You didn't know there were 3 kinds of zebra. I didn't. All right, so we do our layout of our silhouettes, get it really nice, looking good in Illustrator, because it's really fast to lay things out in Illustrator. Then we run a script, and we can export the position and the relative sizing, because I'm using shoulder height for all the food, and then body length for all the primates in order to size these so that they're all, so that their giraffe is tall. And oh, this is a cute little detail. You can see right underneath the elephant, you can see a man. So that's your size guide, and to remind us that hey, we're animals too. All right, so here we have layout, and then the final piece is transforming all the GIS shape files to custom polygons in Tableau. And this is what this process looked like. It was a little bit of a mess, but we got it to work and kind of hooked all together into one viz. But remember what Platon said. It's not about the tools. Great design, and when all those things take a backseat and you get the message. What you really want, when you start this sort of like, have this like emotional, curious spark, you want that to just sort of push through, there it is, and have the tools disappear. Next story is about beers, particularly American beers. And you see, that was just the problem. Because if you remember a couple summers ago, Budweiser launched this. And soon after, they walked into a little bit of a problem. Because you see, Budweiser is an American-invented product. It's made from American ingredients. It's brewed in America, and it's consumed by Americans. So what's the problem? Budweiser isn't owned by an American company. And the internet loved this irony. The internet sank its teeth into this irony. And so when Budweiser wanted to relaunch its flagship product as America this past summer, we started talking. We talked about what kind of information-driven content could we package with that re-release and convince people a little bit more about how American America was. And so I developed a graphic language and created this. And you can see it just keeps looping. And my hope was that there was enough information here that you wouldn't catch it all on the first loop. And on social, you might stick around into the second loop and see what you missed. And so this piece was a little bit less about picking the right map projection. Although there was, I can't tell you how many emails back and forth there were about like the careful placement and the correct placement of all these icons. A little less about the map projection. It was a little bit more about taking inspiration from my favorite working graphic designer, Malika Favre, and taking the graphic language that she established 3 years ago and extending it into motion. It was a little bit less about building the perfect process diagram, although I do think this is a very nice process diagram. It was a little bit more about trying to make things come alive. So it was a little bit more about taking information, even if it's a small amount of information, because this is really small data, but pushing it into a field that is normally completely devoid of data. You know, mass marketing. A little bit more about learning how to sell ideas to a New York ad team. And this is how we sold ideas. This over there, that's what it looks like at the end. But that's not what the thinking looks like. This is what the thinking looks like. Little thumbnail sketches, and a lot of them. And there's a lot we can learn from these types of storytellers. Because their stories, their messaging, impacts millions and millions of people. And I was really thrilled when this project, this past July 4th week, took over Budweiser.com and all their social accounts. So let's talk more about maps. Specifically, I want to talk to you about flow maps. As some of you might know, I've developed a certain enthusiasm for the history of data visualization. And I want to do my best to emphasize the history of data visualization and translate some of that enthusiasm to you. So I thought, what better way to do that than with a really big historic viz. So I want to point some things out to you. Who's ever heard of Charles Joseph Menard? Yeah, a few people. Okay. So this is a piece he did in 1865. And it's my favorite classic data story. What we see here is a small multiple, 3 different maps across 3 years. 1858, 1864, and 1865. And what is this map? Well, I'll help you translate a little bit. Right there, that's French for cotton. And the entire story I'm about to tell you, and more, is all in this viz. From left to right, we have a legend. We have a very nice color scheme, and we have the data. So even though he has these beautiful flows, you can still read the data in the table in a summary format if you want. And what is the story? 1858. This is before the Civil War, and you can see that most of the cotton coming into England and then flowing into Europe is coming from America. And then we fast forward to 1864, and what has happened? Historic event. The American Civil War is raging, and there's no cotton flowing out of America. In fact, Menard made prints just like this for every single year. And you can see in 1861, which isn't shown here, that there's this huge flow of cotton out as everybody sells off all their inventories. And it takes a little while for Europe to react. But in 1864, what has Britain done? It's ramped up production in India, and it started production in Egypt. So there's this sort of like cultural meme of Egyptian sheets, right? It all starts here. We have almost nothing coming out of North Africa pre-war, and then Britain understanding that the American Civil War is going to just decimate cotton coming from the New World, and they start ramping up production. And then finally, we get to post-war. And an entirely new global economy has emerged around this product. You have cotton coming from South America, big cotton coming from India, Egypt's developed, and even America is starting to turn back on. It's a completely different story than what was happening before the war. And it's all done through the Viz. I find this incredibly beautiful. There's a lot of design things to point out with this, in addition to the story. One is that his title block up here tells you what it is, but then right here, Menard is telling you where he got all of his data and how he collected it all. And then here, he has a narrative story walking you through each line bit by bit. And there's a lot also not in only the responsibility of how he is so explicit where his data come from and what the story is, but there's a lot of design in just how he did his maps. As you can see, these aren't real maps. These are sort of cartoony maps. And Menard didn't want to let this giant shape of Africa necessarily get in the way of his nice flow. And he didn't really need to see New England to tell you that this is coming from America. He changed his maps to fit the data and to fit the story he wanted to tell. So let's look at one of these in a little bit more depth, because I just think this is so beautiful. So what's really cool about this is that he's labeling the data right there. So one thing that you have with printing that you don't always have with the screen is that you can move the page very close to you, or you can get out a magnifying glass, and you can see, okay, well, we had 77 coming out of Alexandria, out of Egypt. 4 went this way, and so we have 73 left over. The entire piece is like this. It's beautiful. And then also you can see that the numbers are actually moving, right? And they're rotating to match the flow. I just find it incredibly beautiful. That's Menard. That was done in the 1860s. Put this here. Maybe we'll use it later. And so I was very public about my enthusiasm for the history of data visualization. And that was really wonderful because I met a lot of other people who are really enthusiastic for this history. And one of those people is Howard Weiner. And Howard Weiner has published many books on data visualization. He's a semi-retired professor and really just somebody who I've gotten to spend a lot of time with in the last few months. Because Howard and I wrote an article that's going on the cover of a magazine next week. And so this is the first time I've ever shown it publicly. Now, what you saw with Menard was done quite a long while ago. But this was done quite recently. And so this is the Great Migration. Has anybody ever heard of the Great Migration? Great Migration is considered the single biggest peacetime movement of people in the history of the world. The Great Migration has never been visualized before. And so maybe I'll just take some time to explain to you how this visualization works, because it's clearly in the style of a Menard. And so just like a Menard, sometimes you have to spend a little bit more time with it. The Great Migration is all the African Americans who fled the South after the Civil War in Jim Crow America. And so there's a lot of reasons, both cultural for the South, but also economic opportunities in the North for why they left the South. But we weren't really concerned with understanding the why, because we thought that first we had to understand the what. How many people left? When did they leave? Where did they go? And this has never really been shown before. And so this data is from the US Census, and it was data we had to unearth actually from paper files, because it's not online yet. But what we have are non-whites and whites. And we have a comparison between 4 super regions of how people moved as internal migrants. So what does it mean to be an internal migrant? It means that you're born in one place, but now you live somewhere else at the time of the census. And so you see a little bit of a disparity between the two groups. On the top chart, you have non-whites leaving the South, and on the bottom chart, you have whites going west. And you can think of all the whites going west as escaping the Dust Bowl, as the Judds packing up their car and going to California. And so there's one aspect of this that I want to explain to you in even more depth, because it's something that Howard taught me and I want to teach you. And that's about transformation. If we expand the legend a little bit, we can read it and learn about the number of net migrants is labeled in thousands and indicated by the width of each flow, proportional to the square root of the raw number. So the width of each flow is not actually directly linked to the number. And I'm going to show you why we did that. But let me explain to you some of the things that we're trying to accomplish visually with a static image. We wanted to be able to compare the non-white flow to the white flow in the same chart, even though there were many, many more whites than non-whites who were moving. We wanted to also be able to look at flows between different regions. Even though the majority of blacks who lived in the South were moving out of the South, we still wanted to be able to see if there was any activity, for example, between the West and the Northeast. So we wanted to compare between different groups, but we also wanted to make comparisons visually inside a single group. We also wanted to look across time. And when you look at across time, what you run into is that population levels increase. And so it's very easy for the visual to be dominated simply by population. So let me show you how we did this. Here's Howard. This is how Howard started to teach me. Most of modern statistics is built around data that are normally distributed, if not normal, at least symmetric. But data doesn't always arrive on a doorstep like this. And so we have to transform the data. But how do we transform it? And then Howard let me in on the secret. And the secret is the ladder of transformation. Has anybody ever heard of the ladder of transformation before? Nobody. This is wonderful. Okay. So say you have some data. Your data is the Y value. And it looks like this. And so this is your data. You plot the Y value on the Y-axis, good to go, right? You can't see any patterns in this data. Why? Because it's all squeezed. It's all squeezed at the bottom. It has this very, very long top tail. So what do we do? Well, it's a ladder of transformation. Let's try transforming. Let's take every Y value and square it. We'll go that way. Oh, that's worse. Data is even more squeezed now. All right, we don't like that. Let's bring it back. Let's go the other way. When we go the other way, something magical starts happening. We take the square root transformation. Oh, that looks better. Take a log. Ooh, that's very interesting. We can now start to make some visual comparisons. Again, this is about visual analysis. If you want pure statistical analysis, you can hang out with my robot voice friend. All right, maybe we can go even further. Let's try the inverse. Whoa, barfed. I don't like that. Let's bring it back. Okay. This is the right transformation. And we could give a statistical definition of why this is the right transformation, but the beauty of visual analysis is like, I don't have to defend it. You can just look at it and you can see that now you can make comparisons between all these data. But wait a second. These are strip plots. And strip plots are really nice to get a good, quick look at how the data are performing. But when I make a flow map, I'm not using one-dimensional strip plots. No, no, no. I want to use area. So I want the ink to convey some visual impact. So let's do the same exercise, this time using box areas. So again, here's our data. This isn't so bad, actually. It's like there's some really tiny boxes, but you can see most of them. Some of them are like 1 pixel by 1 pixel. So let's see if we can do anything with this. We go in the wrong direction again. And right away you can see, oh my gosh, like the data is like disappearing and it's being dominated by some big boxes, like not good. So let's go in the other direction. And we take a square root transform. And this actually looks kind of nice. You can actually make some comparisons both across regions and within regions. Let's go to the log. That's what worked last time, right? Ooh. In this case, the log kind of looks kind of mushy. There's not as much contrast between things. Or go even further to the inverse, and it's just completely wrong. So in this case, we really like the square root transformation. And this is the transformation Howard and I chose to use. And what's really interesting about this is the power of the visual. Because we had 2 different transformations for 2 different types of visualizations. So this is a ladder of transformation. It's very, very simple, but I believe it's very, very powerful. I hope that you can all use it. This is sort of our cartoon vignette of Howard and my process as we traded information back and forth. We made a lot of transformations in order to get the chart right. But we just didn't do it in plots like these. We were actually making iterations and transformations over maps. And so this is what our correspondence looked like. How many connections do we plot? Do we go for all 9 regions? Do we go for super regions? Do we just look at the south? And of course, what kind of transformations are we going to look at? So this is sort of the process. This is the visual statistics equivalent of making those little thumbnail sketches. And this is the result. And this is one of 2 original graphics that are coming out in significance. The other one I'm going to show you briefly looks like this. It was, of course, modeled after Napoleon's assault on Moscow. And here you can see, even though population greatly increases from 1880 through 1940, you can see the plots, the lines getting thicker and thicker and thicker, but it's not so thick at the end and so thin in the beginning that you can't see the pattern inside each map. And that's the power of the transformation. The last story is about origins. Continuing thinking about the history of data visualization, I released this project just this month. And I think we have a little animation to show you how it works. So this is the history of data visualization, at least the first 300 years of the history. And it's represented on a timeline map with almost 100 cartoons representing iconic moments in the history of data visualization. First time we saw a timeline, the first time we saw a contour map, the first time the normal curve was ever shown, landmark physical access. And you can click on all of these and you can get information about, not only see the original work, see its title and author, learn a little bit about it, dig deeper if you want. This interactive is a lot of fun to play with, and I hope you play with it. But I want to tell you one of the stories it contains, because it's a story that really blew my mind when I first learned about it. And that's the story of Michael von Longren's degrees of longitude from 1644. And so I want to spend the balance of the talk talking about von Longren. So this is the very first, at least first known, piece of data visualization. When I say data visualization, I mean visualizing statistical information. And maybe this doesn't mean a lot to you right now, but hopefully in 8 minutes or so, it will. The beginning of the 17th century looked like this. Europe was conquering the world. They're sending ships everywhere, and these ships are bringing all kinds of value back into Europe. The problem was this was happening way too often. And why was this happening? Ships couldn't navigate, at least not navigate well. Ships in the 17th century couldn't figure out where their longitude was with any kind of accuracy. And this was a big problem because they'd get blown off course, they'd lose time, and in disastrous situations, they would sink. So enter our hero, von Lohengrin. We thought he had a solution for this problem. And von Lohengrin came from 3 generations of globe makers and map makers, cartographers, our kind of people. And so this is a celestial globe made by his daddy. But von Lohengrin had this sort of idea to the longitude problem. And when you have an idea, what do? We're in the valley, right? So you have an idea, you go to people who have lots and lots of money, you tell them about your idea, and you try to convince them to give you some of their money, right? So that's exactly what von Lohengrin did. And he thought about this idea for a long time. And what I showed you before, that like pixelated thing, so that's where the idea ended up. But this is actually the first view we have of him thinking about this idea. Let's blow it up. Again, really beautiful stuff. So what's going on here? Von Lohengrin had to demonstrate the problem. If you pitch a VC, what's the first thing you do? Oh, let's lay out the problem statement. How big is this opportunity? Same idea. Von Lohengrin looked across an array of maps and globes that people were actively using to navigate and found that the longitudinal distance between the same 2 cities on all of these maps were different. I'll show you what he means. So he anchored in Toledo, Spain. And then he looked at a map. Anybody recognize this one? This is Gerard Mercator's Mercator projection. So he looked at the Mercator projection, and he found Toledo, and he found another city that he could hold constant across all kinds of maps. He looked at Rome. He measured that on the map. He measured that as 21 degrees of longitude. Okay, Mercator, you go on the Viz. And then he kept marching. He kept collecting maps that people were using to navigate. He kept looking at globes that were on ships, people were using to navigate. And he started filling in the Viz. One by one, each data point representing a map. I mean, you need quite incredible access in order to produce this kind of visualization. So this is his first sketch, and we have it because we have a letter that he wrote. Can you imagine that? A letter from 1628 still survives, almost 400 years later. None of your emails are going to survive 400 years from now. He thought about this problem and kept collecting data for 15 years. And he finally submitted it for a patent, for a monopoly. It looked like this. By this point, he had collected 12 data points. And you can see way down here, Toledo is on the edge, Rome is right in the middle. But that's not because Rome represents from mean average. Mean average at this point is still almost 100 years away. We don't have these kinds of statistical tools yet. And again, von Lohengrin was describing the problem, but he also had a solution. His solution to the longitude problem is something called the lunar solution. And the lunar solution turns out didn't work out. But in pursuit of the lunar solution, von Lohengrin gave us something else that is quite beautiful and something that I think almost all of us, have been affected by. Because von Lungren is the first person to ever really map the moon. And so half of the moon's features were named by von Lungren. And in pursuit of this solution, he mapped the moon, but he also gave us his problem statement, the first visualization of any type of statistical data. And the reason I bring up the moon is because I was given the opportunity recently, and this is also something that has never been publicly shared, but I was given this opportunity recently by a company called Planet that has this amazing armada of satellites that take a picture of every spot in the Earth once a day, at least once a day. And one of the really cool things that Planet does is they decorate all of their satellites with art. And so they said, RJ, take a sheet, do some art. We'll put on a satellite and send it up into space. And so I thought for a long time about how to use this really awkward kind of long canvas. And then I learned about von Lungren. I learned about his first data visualization, and I learned also about his interest in the cosmos. And so this, hopefully soon, will be going up into space. So the von Lungren story is just the first of many incredible stories about the history of data visualization. And all these stories, whether they give us new charts, they give us new ways of looking at the world, the constant thread throughout is that the people in these stories were incredibly bold. These people went on expeditions to get new information. These people knew how to draw. They corresponded with all of their contemporaries. Networks were incredibly tight. They argued with one another. They invented charts, but they also invented scientific equipment. And it was all because they're just incredibly impassioned with sort of revealing reality. And so my last message to you is that, the world isn't perfectly known yet. And Keith talked about this as well. We all don't have a perfect view on, what reality is. And maybe we shouldn't, but I think that we can all help the world step a little bit closer to what reality is. And so I hope that you're able to, visit this interactive, learn some of the stories, and that these stories embolden you. So be bold. Go chase new data. Keep meeting up with people. Draw, sketch, visual think. Correspond with lots of people. Christian von Huygens, he had something like 10,000 letters are in his archive. 10,000 handwritten letters. Each one as beautiful as the one I showed. So travel, invent, and let's just go reveal reality with one another. Thank you.
All right, let's give RJ and Keith another round of applause. So to finish out the night, we got one more round of food. If you're interested in talking to the speakers, we'll be all of us will kind of be hanging out there. So see you there. Thank you.